Thank you so much, CJ. And it's really great to welcome all of you to our spring semester offerings of our Theology, Medicine, and Culture seminar. I'm Warren Kinghorn, co-director of the Theology, Medicine, and Culture initiative here at Duke Divinity School. And we exist as an initiative to connect the world of healthcare with the world of Christian faith and practice. As CJ said, we would invite all of you to consider both attending the seminar and to participating in our training programs. And we'd love to talk with you about more of those as you're interested. It's my great privilege today to welcome as our seminar speaker, Dr. Abraham Nussbaum. Dr. Nussbaum is Associate Professor of Psychiatry at the University of Colorado School of Medicine. He is a psychiatrist and also the Chief Education Officer, meaning that he oversees medical student and graduate medical education programs at Denver Health, a large public safety net hospital in Denver, Colorado. He's also an author of many articles, but also of numerous psychiatric textbooks and a very thoughtful memoir called The Finest Traditions of My Calling, One Physician's Search for the Renewal of Medicine, published by Yale University Press in 2016. Abraham is also no stranger to North Carolina, having graduated both from University of North Carolina School of Medicine and also from Duke Divinity School with an MD and a Master of Theological Studies, respectively, and also completed his psychiatric residency at UNC. He's also been a longtime friend and collaborator of ours in Theology, Medicine, and Culture, despite his strong affinity for University of North Carolina. And we want to welcome you, Abraham, not only to the seminar, but also you've been on campus with us for the last couple of days to meet with students and faculty. We appreciate your being here. And thanks for presenting today on the title, Health Equity is Not a Spectator Sport, a Radical Rerooting Using a Three Trees Analogy. Welcome.
Okay, thank you so much for the welcome. I appreciate the chance to be here and to be back at the Divinity School. I'm just down the hall from Warren and Brett here, and I thank Heather for letting me borrow her office. This is my title slide. As an academic physician, let's see if we can make this work. I have a series of disclosures. The biggest ones for this particular article is that this work was originally begun by my good friend, Matt Allen, and has some original art by Sarah Fitzgerald that you'll see. And then that I've received some advice for this article from a terrific person named Tom Koch. But there's also a lot of other people I want to thank. And today I wanted to thank a person who recently retired that at least a couple people on this call know, and it's Georgette Dent. She was the longtime Dean of Student Affairs at the University of North Carolina Med School. And halfway through med school, I approached her and asked her about taking a leave of absence to pursue a Master of Theological Studies here at Divinity School. And she asked me, why Divinity School? And so I'm offering this paper today as a way to kind of answer that question about what theological training does differently in the life of a physician. The paper that I'm going to present to you was recently published. It's not an explicitly theological argument, but I think it shows the difference that thinking theologically does. So one answer, if I were to meet Dr. Dent today about why Divinity School, is that it offers different ways to think, different people with whom to think, different ways to work, and different ways to worship. And I would argue that most people would see that our broken medicine and healthcare system needs these different ways. One of them is this terrific life-changing book that I read during Divinity School that encourages people to think analogically. So today I wanted to show you one way that you could think analogically. If we think back a couple years, as the acute SARS-CoV-2 pandemic exploited chronic inequalities that had previously been existed, a group of public health experts issued urgent calls for health equity. This is a picture of what the NIH portrays health equity from their website. Some of those urgent calls were issued from voices who have sought equity for generations, while other calls for health equity were amplified by voices less experienced in making such advancements. They all said they wanted the removal of obstacles to health so more people could flourish, but they meant very different things by these calls. Some wanted fair and just health opportunities. Some wanted equal health outcomes. Some wanted the redress of health inequities. Despite all their differences, all of them settled on describing health equity as a kind of spectator sport. Today, I would like to argue that we need a more relational and radical, from the Latin word meaning rooted, analogy for health equity. To describe health equity, many public health experts turned, like grandparents trying to be hip, to a baseball meme, which combined one generation's pastime with another generation's passing fad. In its simplest form, this meme shown here is a two-panel illustration in which a group of three spectators, each of different heights, stands behind an outfield wall on three boxes while observing a baseball game. In the first panel, each spectator stands upon a single box, but while the taller spectators can see the action and have raised their arms in triumph, the shortest spectator cannot see over the wall and their arms are down in defeat. In the second panel, the boxes have been redistributed, so each spectator can see over the outfield wall. The hands of all the spectators are now raised above their heads. The illustration was created quickly by Craig Frohl, a University of Cincinnati Business School professor, to reinforce a political point after the 2012 election. But it spread gradually over the next decade, initiating discussions about the relationships between equality and equity and related foundational topics like what we mean when we speak of justice, fairness, liberation, and opportunity. In one popular version, the first panel is labeled equality, and the second table is labeled equity. Sometimes the skin color and clothes of the spectators are altered to gesture towards racial equity. Sometimes the outfield fence is removed in the third panel, and the result is labeled liberation. Sometimes viewers are asked to imagine a fourth panel beyond our understanding. These and other permutations have been featured in conference presentations and circulated on social media networks, enabling the kind of metaphorically viral cultural moment you can share even when socially distanced by a real-life virus. I experienced an initial aha moment with this illustration, a flash of insight about the difference between equality and equity. The illustration invites that insight by obscuring the players, thus encouraging us to identify with the spectators in the foreground. Since the spectators face the game, viewers can project a range of identities upon the spectators. Like many viewers, I emphasized with the smallest figure, a person initially unable to see the game despite standing on a box. And I was cheered by the second panel, where the redistribution of a box allowed the smallest figure to see the game alongside the taller figures. It is a deeply human experience to feel pain for a person on the outside of a desirable moment and relief when that person is included in the moment. It's also a deeply current experience to show your commitment to health equity by viewing an illustration, especially one that portrays health equity in terms of having a good view of a baseball game. Think about it again, and you start worrying about the layered suggestion that health equity is a spectator sport all the way down, that health equity is something to be seen. Baseball, after all, is a spectator sport in which an audience cheers, jeers, or passively watches the players without substantially affecting the game itself. To participate in a spectator sport, you simply need to redistribute the viewing boxes. But it matters who redistributes the boxes, to what purpose, and the relationships in which they do so. Even more, mere redistribution will limit the role of participants to being spectators, neglecting what we ought to do when someone wants a role in the game, wants to change the rules of the game, or simply refuses to play. And you cannot just take down the fence to free the spectators, because the metaphorical equivalent of being struck by a line drive triple is impossible to describe as liberating. The further the analogy is extended, the more it breaks down. Precisely because achieving health equity is not the work of spectators. Whatever you believe health equity to be, its pursuit does not need spectators. It needs people committed to the shared work of removing obstacles and enabling flourishing. It also does not need to define equity at the expense of equality. The baseball and boxes memes does this, and so do the iterative memes that have followed, in which equity is variously figured as a staggered starting line for a foot race, fitting bicycles to a person's ability. This is from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, or providing the right-sized ladder for a person to pick apples from a tree, as in this image from Johns Hopkins. In each of these illustrations, equality is defined as a deficient concept improved through the redistribution of a desirable experience, so that everyone achieves the same outcome. Defining equality by what it lacks neglects the many positive meanings of equality, the pursuit of which has motivated civil rights initiatives around the world. Defining equity as equality plus a redistribution also limits the meaning of equity to a quantitative perspective, a measurable outcome, whether a win in a baseball game or a foot race, or the number of apples a person picks from a tree, implying that equity is a discrete outcome. Health equity is not like a baseball game, I would say, or a foot race, in which someone wins and someone else loses, but I believe a relationally mediated process of constantly pursuing justice, in which equality is a necessary part. Baseball, after all, is the most individualistic of the major American team sports. The core action of baseball is a transaction between the pitcher and the catcher as they exchange the ball with each other, with the hitter attempting to reverse their exchange and drive the ball into the field of play. A successful hitter will do so on every one of their trips. A successful hitter will do it on every third trip to the plate. An unsuccessful hitter will eventually be out of the game. By invoking baseball, the analogy implicitly enforces individualistic accounts of health at the expense of communal aspects of health. When the analogies are shifted even further to individual sports like foot races, the analogy becomes explicitly individualistic. Healthcare is not an individualistic transaction between a consumer and a provider, but a relational activity, a mutual giving and receiving between practitioner and patient. In the core action of healthcare, unlike baseball, a wise practitioner listens to a fellow person who has become a patient, and together they respond to illness and impairment or work together to prevent disease. A successful practitioner aids every patient in some combination of care and cure through a therapeutic relationship. This relationship can span an entire life, not just a person's productive years, because health is a process along continuums of ability and disability, function and impairment, which depend upon the environment in which a person is nurtured. Health equity is also relational, because we are more healthy when everyone is healthy and every place engenders health. To illustrate health equity aptly, we cannot privilege spectator experiences, win-loss outcomes, or transactional encounters in culturally specific analogies that reinforce neoliberal accounts of health. All those neoliberal accounts of health define health equity as an equality outcome, without deference or regard to how this is achieved, which is, as McIntyre recently reminded us in Ethics and the Conflicts of Modernity, how capitalist accounts of economics depart from virtue ethics. Instead, we need something more radical, something that gets down to the very roots of how we fall ill and achieve health. We need portraits of organic and relational accounts of health equity. We need analogies with cross-cultural appeal that can access truths inaccessible to literal language. 2 decades ago, the physician and epidemiologist, Kamara Jones, offered such an analogy. Dr. Jones illustrated different levels of racism, institutionalized, personally mediated, and internalized, through line drawings, it was 2 decades ago, of plants growing in different flower boxes, one with poor, rocky soil, and one with rich, fertile soil. Jones called it the gardener's tale. Unlike more recent literal analogies to individual humans watching baseballs and riding bicycles, which implicitly invite people to see themselves and simultaneously fail to see others in the human figures, Jones' analogy was to the interrelated and interdependent complexity of non-human living things, encouraging a viewer's solidarity with the created world. Jones' analogy has only proved more prescient over time. In the intervening decades, biologists have shown the way plants are interrelated in dynamic exchanges that reinforce their mutual dependency. Lichen, mushrooms, trees all mutually depend upon each other in ways that biologists continue to limn. In a forest, a diversity of plants support each other, sharing carbon, nitrogen, water, and more through what is goofily called the wood wide web. Season, soil, and sun affect how all these networks operate. The complexity of these systems make baseball look positively basic. But then, any human community is more complex than its games. The discoveries of botanical pioneers reinforces Jones' attention to our interdependency with each other and other aspects of the created world. Mindful of her analogy in these botanical insights, I cheered at passages like this from Richard Powers' best-selling novel about trees, The Overstory. Describing the insight of a scientist, Powers wrote, "Networked together underground by countless thousands of miles of living fungal threads, her trees feed and heal each other, keep their young and sick alive, pool their resources and metabolites into community chess." That is a vision. Countless connections, spanning thousands of miles, feeding and healing each other, building up community chess, that I believe is far more apt for health than any spectator support. In pursuit of that vision, my friend Matt Allen commissioned an artist to sketch an image of 3 plants. The illustration is of plants because plants live in relationship with each other and with other creatures with whom they flourish in their shared environment, and because the concept of a plant features in the wisdom literature of traditions around the world. The illustration includes plants at various stages of growth because it does not require peak ability to deserve appropriate nutrients in an environment, and it includes plants together because they are not winners or losers, but parts of a shared environment. We offer this illustration as a productive image of health equity, but we know that for an idea to travel, it must be interpreted and transmitted. We invite transmission and interpretation while offering 3 initial frames for the 3 plants illustration. First, we are rooted in intrinsic equality. Intrinsic equality speaks to our shared human dignity and our equal worth as human beings. While we realize that the plant analogy has limits, bryophytes are plants without roots, it is widely understood that roots are a universally shared feature of flora. Plants are rooted in the same shared planet, but by different roots, which require different conditions to flourish. Similarly, all humans share a common humanity, but different cultures. So pursuing health equity requires culturally adapted interventions to encourage flourishing. Second, we cultivate equitably. Equality is less a singular event like a baseball game and more of a process like cultivating plants. All plants need certain things to survive and eventually flourish, but not all plants need these things in the same amounts at the same time. Plants have a specific culture, the conditions suitable for their growth. Conditions of flourishing are dynamic rather than static, requiring different sustenance at different times. Certain plants are more vulnerable to external dangers, like clear-cutting and drought, than others and need extra attention and protection to enable their full growth. When working to reduce a health disparity, we need to target interventions by, say, cultivating trust through community health workers or language concordant communication. Third, we flourish in experiential equality. We are all unique, but we have a shared goal of growth and prosperity so that we can, both individually and communally, produce fruit. While the fruit one plant produces will be different from the fruit another plant produces, each fruit is an intrinsic good and collectively necessary for biological diversity. This speaks to the shared need for human flourishing, or what Tyler Vanderbilt calls a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good. Today, who would say that all aspects of their life are good? After a century of comparative success against infectious diseases, the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic has been what Mary Shelley prophesied, an unaccustomed ravage, one that has challenged our public health systems like no other event in this century. At its best, it reminded us that we are connected across cultures through our shared vulnerability to illness. As the pandemic progressed through Denver, we saw that our vulnerabilities varied and that our immunity would only develop together. So we cheered when effective vaccines were developed. Figuring out ways to vaccinate broadly seemed initially like a distribution problem. Just as in the baseball and boxes meme, where you needed to get the right viewing box to the spectators with the greatest need, the question was the best way to distribute the vaccine by getting it to the folks who needed it first. Frontline workers, older adults, the immunocompromised, people living in congregate dwellings. However, as distribution efforts continued, the vaccine was publicly resisted in many times and places. Achieving health outcomes, equal health outcomes, required something more than distribution. So vaccination was variously incentivized and mandated. We needed to change our health equality model. In his own recounting of how the pandemic will change society, the physician and sociologist Nicholas Christakis reminds readers that the majority of the public health advances against infectious disease can be attributed to non-pharmaceutical interventions. Some of those interventions include public health measures like masking, quarantining, social distancing, and hand washing. Other interventions include improvement of socioeconomic well-being. Christakis observed that the US enjoyed greater social cohesion when it faced the influenza pandemic of 1917, resulting in greater engagement of communal efforts to fight pandemic. From my perspective, bioethicists, public health experts, and organized medicine failed because we no longer realized that we are rooted together. As we learn from our failures, we need to think more cogently about how even well-intentioned and evidence-based medical and public health initiatives interrupted social relationships, especially for our most vulnerable, by closing community sites like schools, libraries, and homeless shelters. If bioethicists and public health leaders had emphasized our interrelationship in both vulnerability and immunity, as in the three plants analogy, we might have seen that we needed masking and vaccination campaigns, but also the analogical equivalence of good soil, sunlight, water, and healthy neighbors. We might have kept schools and churches open in some fashion instead of keeping cannabis dispensaries and liquor stores open, as we did in Colorado. We flourish through the activities and relationships that make life good together. The three plants illustrations awareness that an ecosystem missing one plant is no longer the same ecosystem is echoed in the World Health Organization's maxim, adapted from the rallying cry of the civil rights leader Fannie Lou Hamer, that no one is immune until everyone is immune. We rely on each other for our well-being, just as the plants in an ecosystem rely upon other plants. Working for equity, and thus experiential equality, has and will require varied solutions, the best of which engender solidarity through community leadership, rather than mandates from above, thereby reminding us of our mutual interdependence. Discussions about what is just, what is a healthy community, and how we can be responsible to each other are the critical questions of bioethics. The three plants illustrations helps frame these questions by showing equity as active relational work rather than a passive spectator activity. However, as with any metaphor, our proposed solution leaves questions intentionally unanswered. In the three plants illustration, each plant is flourishing together in a shared climate, kind of ideal state. The illustration could be deconstructed and discussed so that it would look different in different communities at different times, giving a visual cue to a community about the extent which they are and are not flourishing and why. The illustration invites questions about the role of the soil. Who will amend the soil? Remove the weeds? Cultivate these plants? Is historically overwatering one plant deleterious for the plants who fail to receive the necessary water and for the overwatered plant itself? We believe these questions can be worked through only in the communities most affected by their answers, as we respond together to the twin pandemics of acute infections and chronic injustice. As we work to build a more equitable and equal ecosystem, we offered the illustration to foster thoughtful discussion and actionable understanding. Finally, I offer the three plants for the post-pandemic pursuit of health equity that is at its core radical, from the Latin radix, meaning rooted. Equity is rooted in our shared equality. It's part of what makes us all uniquely and beautifully human, and part of why we all ought to work together towards equity. Advancing health equity is not a competition like a baseball game or a foot race, but intentional cultivation that removes obstacles and promotes flourishing, so we can all nurture our good fruit. The framework helps explore the why of health equity and the how, helps answer the for what question, and offers ways to visualize current and future states. It allows bioethics to learn from the current COVID-19 public health crisis in a way unavailable to the baseball and boxes meme. And like any good analogy, it leaves questions unanswered, encouraging and inviting conversation, iteration, and eventually innovation. Instead of spectators, the three plants illustration seeks active participants in a discussion of the shared activities necessary for human flourishing. And then, since I'm here today at Duke in the Divinity School, it's also a reminder that doing so will require theology, because it is only in theology that we have sustained discussions of solidarity and its relationship to subsidiarity. It is only in theology that we can understand how radically interdependent we are, and how limited our bioethics is by simplistic accounts of autonomy. It is only in theology that we can remember the common humanity in which our intrinsic equality is rooted. And it is only in theology that we can fully see the damage caused by the intrinsic inequality of the American healthcare system. And it is only in theology that we can approach accounts of true human flourishing. Thank you for your time and for the opportunity to share this paper with you. And then I'll stop sharing and invite conversation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nussbaum. We have a good bit of time now for conversation. I see some questions that are showing up in the chat, and I would encourage you to continue to send those questions to me, and I will pose them to Dr. Nussbaum. Also, if you wish, what we can do is I would invite you to go to the Reactions tab on the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you wish to directly ask a question to Dr. Nussbaum, and then raise your hand, and I'll work to both include those questions that are submitted in the chat and also to call on those who've had their hands raised and invite you to unmute and show your screen and to ask a question directly. So we'll do it that way. I want to start, Abraham, by a question that I think is really just an attempt at clarification of your argument. And so this is a good thing to start on. This attendee says, in the baseball analogy, those concerned about equity are not encouraging passiveness, but a busy attentiveness to make sure everyone can see the game, that everyone has an equal opportunity. What's the person concerned to promote equity doing differently in that analogy than in the three trees analogy? How does cultivating healthy rootedness look different than working to make sure everyone has a chance to see?
Yeah, great question. I think it's a very different thing to have an opportunity to see a game, even though that's important, than to actually be a part of a community. And the question of rootedness is ultimately of being in a place and of growing and flourishing in that place. Watching a game doesn't necessarily require belonging to that place or flourishing in that place. I think rooting does.
This is kind of participation, connectedness to place and to the flourishing of a place. Is that okay? That's helpful.
Yeah, and that the question is that then in doing so, then that one can bear fruit is a different question than saying that then in doing so, one can watch a game.
Thank you. Next question we have is, the questioner says, I'd like to know how the incarcerated population segregated from society and relationship fits into this framework. Thank you.
Great question. What a lovely question. I thank the person for asking that. I don't know, right? We were trying to come up with something different. I would say that I think you can think about different ways about people being incarcerated. I see people incarcerated as part of my medical practice. And one thing that I would say is I think you could talk about that as somebody being uprooted from their community. There are certainly kinds of social networks and community that form among people who are incarcerated, but by and large, they are uprooted. And I would say that that's one of the advantages that you can say. It's a different thing to use that analogy of being uprooted and taken away from your place where you could flourish and being segregated than to say in the other kind of health equity analogy that you just don't get a ticket to the game, right? I think uprootedness is a better way to describe that experience. But I don't know. That's a good question. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Alternating, I see that Stanley Hauerwas has his hand raised, and so Stanley would invite you to unmute and show your camera and to ask a question directly.
Abraham, I was interested in how you account for difference. Equity oftentimes flattens the world, and how difference can be acknowledged without gross discrimination seems to me to be one of the challenges.
Thank you, my old friend and teacher, for asking the question. I think that's part of what we're trying to get at is in the versions of health equity where it's leveling of boxes in order to see the game, what matters is the outcome, that one can see the game, right? That's the outcome. And the question of how you get there doesn't matter. Part of what we're trying to get people to think about is that health equity can be about the question about how each person can bear their different fruit. And they are different, right? There's excellences that are unapproachable to me that I'll never have, that there's no amount of cultivation of me or a number of boxes that I can stand on that would make me capable of certain things. I'm never going to play NBA basketball as one small, modest example. But I think that we have to move towards a version of equity that is more about helping each person and community realize their fruits rather than achieving equal outcomes. Part of what I think McIntyre's getting at in Ethics and the Conflicts of Modernity is that focus on equality of outcomes rather than process is something that is itself capitalism, right? And not a virtue ethics question. I hope I'm not misreading him, but that's the way that I would read him, Stanley.
Thank you. Stanley, did you have any follow-up to that?
No, I think Abraham's exactly right about how to read McIntyre and what he's trying to do.
And I think that's part of what's missing from discussions about health. Part of what I think prickles people about discussions about health equity is that it can seem to focus on a flattening of outcomes rather than helping the process by which each group and each person helps to achieve their excellence, their best possible version of themselves. And I think that's a difference that we're trying to illustrate visually.
Thank you. Next question comes from an attendee who says, I love this rethinking and applaud the organic metaphor. However, I wonder if rooting as an analogy for health equity in the natural world using plants is really free of competitive elements, as Abraham suggests. Seems like the plant kingdom is as ruthlessly competitive as the animal kingdom when you look carefully. And this attendee sent in the message, watching David Attenborough's BBC production of Green Planet drives home both the synergistic and competitive elements of plant coexistence vividly.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know enough about plant botany to answer that question. I worry that when I watch beautiful nature documentaries, and there are some really remarkable ones, it seems very hard to not anthropomorphize that world and talk about it in ways that we map onto our own world. I guess I would say that my sense of a functioning forest is that it is not nearly as cutthroat as American society, and is not sorting out winners and losers with the same kinds of cruelties and injustices. I could be wrong about that, and I'm happy to be corrected by a botanist. But my sense is that it's a lot more equal than the process by which some people get to be professional baseball players or not. Even on a simple level, right? If we think about half the species, there's no way they're ever going to get paid as well for playing the same sport as the male half of the species, right? Women softball players don't get paid what male baseball players pay. So yes, I think that one could talk about how cutthroat a forest is. I suspect it's still more just.
This leads to another question of clarification that's also a larger question. So you used a term midway through your talk, a neoliberal account of health, and then you moved on. And I'm not sure that all on the call really are familiar with what you mean by that term. And so I guess I wonder, could you say more about what is a neoliberal account of health? And then maybe speaking from your specific experience as a clinician and now a health administrator, how do you see neoliberalism at work in the structures of healthcare as you as you inhabit them?
Yeah, part of when I was asked to give this talk, part of what I would say is that there are many things that I enjoyed during the pandemic. Nothing's ever good about a pandemic, but some responses are better than others. I enjoyed the TMC offering this series of Zooms. And part of what I was trying to do in this talk is to make reference to some of the other talks I'd heard on TMC. So when I talked about the pandemic as an unaccustomed ravage, that's a quote from Mary Shelley's The Last Man. And in my memory, I remember Lori Zoloff talking about that novel during the pandemic on this series. And that's part of that's where I would not have read that novel without Lori. And when I talked about a neoliberal accounts, it was Bruce Rogers Vaughan participating in this series previously. And so I would recommend that folks who wanted to know more about that would read his terrific work. I would say that in my clinical practice, I'm privileged to work at Denver Health and to be a professor at the University of Colorado. I work on an academic safety net hospital. 80 to 90% of my patients have Medicaid or uninsured. Most of them have come to encounter me through an encounter with the mental health system. They are terrifically uprooted, and they are focused on alone in terms of their specific behaviors leading to them today. So the questions, even the way that we encounter, are questions about what did you do to attempt suicide today? How did you lose touch with reality? How did you relapse in your substance use disorder? Those are the big things that bring people there. There is a focus on them in relationship to their person individually, and a focus on their function really related to the question about how they can participate in the economic life of society. Right? One of the things that we see all the time is that folks who have the same set of symptoms, but who for various reasons of class or race can make it don't wind up being stuck with the inpatient psychiatrist at the safety net hospital in one way or another. So I would say that when you read Bruce Rogers Vaughan, it really helps you to see all of the ways in which the contemporary mental health system is very much governed by a neoliberalist ethic.
Thank you. Next question, the attendee says, in Catholic social teaching, there's the idea that human dignity requires each person to be the active agent of their own flourishing insofar as possible. How does that idea fit for you into the three trees analogy?
Gosh, I don't know. I haven't thought about it. I really appreciate the question. I'm not sure. I think it would be fair to say that we're influenced by that question from Catholic social teaching of solidarity, but I've not thought through that particular question. If the person, I don't see that person in the chat, if they'd like to come off mute and offer a suggestion, I'd be grateful.
Yeah, I'll invite them to do that if they want to do so by raising their hand. So that sounds great. Thanks. Next question. The attendee says, in a health system where most visits, this kind of relates somewhat to what you were just talking about, Abraham. In a health system where most visits are one-on-one, especially in community and low-resource health settings, I'm curious of Dr. Nussbaum's thoughts on how by working in healthcare, we can facilitate community growth and rootedness.
Oh gosh, lots of ways, right? One of them in my field is to continue seeing patients in person. And increasingly, I think mainstream psychiatry recognizes that there's benefits to having integrated care and seeing people as much as possible in integrated care settings, seeing people in community settings where they receive care. So we have 10 federally qualified health centers, and I would say that they have a very different culture than the main hospital. Our federally qualified health centers are much more engaged with the community. So I think there's all sorts of concrete ways to do that fit within the flow of many physicians. I think that a further reimagining would be something much more dramatic, right? To be much more rooted in the community. But that's at least a start, is to think about seeing folks in integrated care settings and in community health centers that really are much more part of the community than other kinds of health settings. And then I see that our mutual friend, Far Curlin, has his hand raised.
Yeah, before we recognize Far, I want to follow up on that and just ask, you've done a lot of work on the clinician-patient relationship, which is dyadic. I mean, it does take place in a one-on-one relationship, but how can focus on the therapeutic alliance and the clinician-patient relationship actually contribute to this three trees analogy? How can that be more than transactional in your experience and in your thinking about the alliance?
Yeah, I think that one of the questions, Warren and I are both psychiatrists, if I may, and so we both work within the diagnostic framework of the DSM. There's many strengths of the DSM framework, but an acknowledged limitation of it is that it focuses on the individual person and isolates them in order to make a diagnosis specific to them. But the DSM is self-consciously meant, even though it is often not used this way, to be the beginning of a conversation, not the end of it. And so you can ask someone about the other people in their life. It's an important question if you truly believe that health is relational. And you, by asking someone about that, you're building the therapeutic alliance, right? By building this kind of commitment and recognizing that they have a sense of place and culture. Warren and I have written together some work on this, and we've talked about the ways in which you ask someone, what do you think's going on with your health? What do other people in your life do to make your health worse or better? These kinds of questions, often from the psychiatric anthropology literature. I was talking to Martha Carlo before this talk about how we both love the question, what do you fear most about your illness? How does your illness affect your ability to participate in your community, right? What's the community that's important to your health? These kinds of questions both build the alliance, gather more data, and help to root a patient back in that. All the evidence that I'm aware of in some of the psychiatric literature is that diseases that we think of like major depressive disorder are sometimes, but not usually, isolated illnesses. They're often in response to life's problems, which are almost always relational. And so if you don't ask about them, you're not getting to the, forgive the pun, the roots of what's going on with somebody. So, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. I'd like to invite Farquharlin to unmute and show his camera and ask his question.
Hey, Abraham, that was my question about Catholic social teaching. You started to answer it in some of your responses to others. Stanley mentioned one of the challenge of how do you reckon with difference. And it seems to me a corollary is that difference made by the extent to which a person is cooperating in their own integral development, sort of is responding to the opportunities to them to bear the fruit that is theirs to bear. And I mean, we see it in clinical care on a clinical rotation now. And I think sometimes it seems that the focus on equity can portray things as if there is a difference, then it is a lack of people external to the person who's experiencing the difference, helping them, but not really have a space for asking the question, what is theirs to do? And I'm just curious your thoughts on that, which is obviously related to subsidiarity and as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question and for clarifying. And even more, thanks for joining while you're doing the clinical work. Thanks for doing the clinical work today and for joining in the midst of that. I think that's a critical question, right? When I think about psychiatric illness, which is what I think the most about, I had an awesome medical training, but I'm not an internist like you are, Far. So I tend to think about the ways in which psychiatric illnesses, what do they hold in common? And one of the things that I think that they hold in common is a diminishment of agency in different ways, sometimes through a very biological process with things like Alzheimer's disease, and sometimes with things that we have initially chosen and then are unable to stop choosing, right? So we think about this with things like a substance use disorder, that it's an initial choice to have alcohol or use an opiate, but then eventually the biological substance reduces or erodes one's agency. So I would say that as a psychiatrist, one of our goals is continually to help to build someone's agency to achieve health, to move towards health, and to become flourishing. Not everybody, if we think about cultivating everybody's individual excellences, they're going to be different. They have to be. Like, that's part of the celebration of diversity of life, is that they're going to have different excellences. But we can cultivate the agency of everyone to pursue that excellence. That is one strength of the sports metaphors for health equity, right? Is that it implicitly acknowledges that people are going to have different outcomes, right? Who gets invited to be a Major League Baseball player? It's a very small percentage of people. Who gets invited to run a foot race? I just think that we need something that's more expansive for that. And so I would say, Far, that I think that is in some ways the clinical work of every mental health clinician and a lot of primary clinicians, to say, how can I encourage a person's agency so that they can move back towards health and to remoralization and through community. So thank you for that question.
Great. Well, I want to give credit to Daniel Hall for putting the lyrics to a Bonnie Raitt song in the chat. So thanks for that. It's probably the first time Bonnie Raitt's shown up in a TMC seminar. So thanks for that. Our next question is, what is a new, so you have experience at Denver Health working a lot with the unhoused population in housing insecure population in Denver. I mean, how, from your perspective as a clinician, would you think about the challenge of homelessness as it relates to health and health equity?
Gosh, thank you so much for the question. I'll also just say that Bonnie Raitt is a Quaker, at least was raised Quaker. She volunteered with the American Friends Service Committee, so maybe you should try to get her on this call. She's got a lot more excellences than I do and better hair. So you should try to get Bonnie Raitt on to do a theology, medicine, and culture project.
True.
And much about the hair, Abraham.
I mean, I'm pretty sure it's not hard to have better hair. I don't know that this excellence has not been cultivated in a while, Daniel. So in answer to your question, right? So before I went to med school, I worked with homeless people in Chicago. It was that experience that got me thinking about medical school. I've been privileged to take care of people experiencing homelessness most of my medical career. It's a big part of our patient population in Denver Health. And we've seen a tremendous change in that in the last 10 years. Denver's like a lot of cities has seen a tremendous economic boom, but not a commensurate collection of housing. And so the number of people who are experiencing homelessness in Denver has exploded. And we have a mayoral race coming up, which is a big deal in Colorado. There's a way in which the mayor of Denver is the most powerful elected position in the state of Colorado because they have more to control of the discretionary budget. The single most important issue in that mayoral race is the response to homelessness. And so we as a city are asking that question. I would tell you that one thing I like about something like this analogy is that it's about the question of rootedness. I think people need to pursue housing first options. During the pandemic, one of the things we did as a hospital, we decided to turn a parking lot into a safe housing temporary stay, where for 6 months people could camp. There's a lot of camping in Denver. That's one of the debates in Denver is whether or not a person experiencing homelessness can camp in public spaces or not. And so we decided to dedicate a large parking lot where we had 75 people stay for 6 months. And we had a lot of folks within the institution who really felt strongly that the goal was to get people to work and to get them engaged in work and through work and support to get them out of homelessness. And very few of the people who were living there applied for work, sought work, and none of them stayed in work at Denver Health. And to me, it was a reminder that it's going to be very hard to get someone out of long-term homelessness as opposed to acute homelessness through something like that. I would tell you that idea of saying, we're going to offer you a job. We're a big hospital. We need people. We're the fourth biggest employer in Denver. We have jobs waiting. So we had people who said, we need to give this person a job and then they'll have money and then they can afford housing and get back on their feet. That's an example of giving somebody the box so they can see the game. We have a job, you can have it. Then you'll be able to be a part of this game. And it didn't work for us. It didn't. And partly it didn't work because the people that I meet who are experiencing homelessness are so uprooted that one advantage of being homeless for them, and there are no real advantages being homeless, but that there is a sociality within their particular homeless group. So we've been advocating and pushing the city to open housing first options where people can live in groups that they identify, groups that they've formed on the street that provide them some kind of human community. I don't know if that's going to be a solution, but Warren, in the last couple of years, we've tried this boxes version of homelessness, of responding to homelessness. And I think we need to try one where we try to root people first.
Thank you. We probably have time for one or two or three more questions. The next question, and so please do raise your hand if you would like to ask a question. Actually, I see now Daniel Hall's hand is up. Dan, did you want to add to
I'll just add one quick addition to what Abraham just talked about. In and around 2000, I participated in an event called the Urban Plunge in Toronto, where I was dropped off with a buck and a bad map in the middle of Toronto to live among the homeless for 3 days as a cross-cultural learning experience before I went to Africa. And I was immediately recognized as someone among the homeless population who did not belong, brought underneath their wing, protected, introduced to an entire network of interconnection that I would never have known about, watched a guy's neck get broken in a fight while the rest of the homeless population was protecting me from shit that was happening that I wouldn't have known going on. It's amazing. I went away, the most strong memory that I come away from that whole experience was how richly rooted that community was in a way that I had no insight to whatsoever.
Thanks, Daniel. I really appreciate that. That was something that became clear to me. My first job was working my first experience adjacent to healthcare was working in a respite center for medically injured homeless people on the west side of Chicago. And I'd collect people from hospitals when they were ready to be discharged. And then part of my job was to go and go with people to the places where they had their stuff. There was good and bad things about the job, just like any other job. But the hardest thing about the job was that one of my jobs was to get somebody checked into the facility. And that included going through all their belongings and making sure that there was no contraband, no drugs, and nothing dangerous. And what's hard is that those are good things, right? You don't want people carrying knives or guns into a homeless shelter. But the way that it was done, in hindsight, feels pretty horrible and dehumanizing, right? We'd go through people's stuff and they were in a bag. And one of the things that you'd see is, I remember people would have boxes of cornstarch in the winter in Chicago. And I'd ask why, because I had no clue. And they would say, cornstarch fills you up when you're hungry, right? And they would have items to help them stay awake and be with the people that they knew. We all want to know the people that we know. And I would say that health equity is not just about outcomes. It's about relationship and being restored and recognized in that, even for people who are homeless. So
Abraham, we have one question in the chat, and then Brett McCarty has a question. I'm going to read the question that we have in the chat and then ask Brett to ask his question, and then you can respond, and then as our final response. This, I think, is from a baseball fan. This attendee says, going back to baseball as a spectator sport, it's true that I can stay at home and watch a game by myself, or I can go to a stadium and read a book during the game, but sports bars and stadiums often host crowds who want to experience the game together. They cheer or boo together. They do the wave, well, not at sports bars. What do these behaviors mean for the assertion that spectators are passive?
yeah,
Hold
great.
that thought, and then let Brett ask his question, and then you can respond to both as you see fit.
Abraham, thanks so much for this. I love the shift in metaphor, but am wary of all the history of funding mechanisms that are predicated on individual encounters and the kind of individualizing that the money flows have long run along. And so maybe to shift registers, Jesus also liked to talk about gardens, and he has the parable of the sower or of the soils. And I don't know, is healthcare just too rocky of a place, or is it, too downtrodden of a path to imagine these gardens springing forth? Or maybe another way to ask the question is, you're an administrator who's kind of committed your life to healthcare institutions and medical education reform and the field of psychiatry. Give us a word of hope for the possibilities there.
Wow, those are two different questions. Warren, I'm not sure I can answer both of those. I'll just say that in the paper that this cites, we cite that most baseball fans actually do watch games alone, and that is a part of it. I do think there's something to watching it with other people. I confess I watched the World Cup. I watched Argentina beat France in a sports bar, and it was pretty awesome with my daughter. So I think there's something to that. I will say that in that analogy, what I wanted was the communion with her as my daughter, and the ability to enjoy this experience with her. It wasn't that I cared about the game itself. And so if health equity, if we're committed to the baseball metaphor, then it should be about the three people from behind the stands communing with each other and with other people. And that's a different thing. It's pretty, I ran by the Cameron Crazies sleeping out tonight. That's what they're getting, is that kind of experience of camping out there. I want to just end, you asked me to end with a word of hope. I would just say that this institution changed my life. The University of North Carolina School of Medicine changed my life. They taught me a ton, and I'm honored that Georgette Dent joined this call today, and Stanley Harawas did. And the word of hope to me is that I was a runty little tree, and they helped root me in this beautiful soil of the goodliest land of North Carolina and the longleaf pine, and helped me to flourish a little bit. And I'm really deeply grateful for it. So I'll just end by saying thank you to everyone in the North Carolina, and go Heels. Thanks.
Thank you, Abraham. It's been really great to have these conversations today. I want to also thank Talisha McCulloch for the comment that you left in the chat. Thanks to all of you for attending, for giving your time to us today. And please join us again for our next TMC seminar on February 3rd at the same time. Jason Ash of the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, will be presenting on the topic of racism, driver of health disparities, outlier in our theology of illness. Please join then, and please go in peace. Thanks so much.